Rachel, what does being a great session player mean to you?
For me, it means being an instrument of musical make-a-wish. Whoever is in the artist or producer seat should be able to say whatever they want and request anything from me. And ultimate success for me is to be able to give it to them in that moment.
That's incredible. So in the early days of your childhood and upbringing, where did your musical journey start that got you to the point where you could just pull all these different styles out of a hat?
I started playing bass when I was 10 because my dad was a bass player. And I had like an old Guild, like one of those heavy metal basses with a capo on it because I was a little thing, you know. And I practiced for a little while. And then when I turned 13, I went to rock and roll camp in Austin. And suddenly I went from like being a ballerina as a little girl to being like in a bunch of rock bands. That just kind of led me to get serious about music. So I joined the jazz band in high school and, you know, did my due diligence of learning how to read and all that stuff. I guess I've always been kind of an overachiever. Like I knew that what would be pleasing to my parents and grandparents would be to like really learn how to read music and like go to college for music. So I also did that. The whole fall of my senior year, I just lived in learning Donna Lee by Jaco Pastorius. Or he didn't write it, but the Jaco Pastorius version. And that was my audition piece for Berklee. And I auditioned and got a full ride there. So then I went to Berklee College of Music. I was there for 3 years and I graduated because I wanted to like not throw away money. And while I was there, I got signed to Sony Epic as an artist for a song that I wrote by myself for a soldier. And so I just kind of kept on my path of overachieving. So at Berklee and in high school, I was really in these sort of R&B, jazz, funk genres. But then when I wrote my song that got me signed, and the songs that I've always gravitated towards, just like songwriter, folk, Americana, country stuff that's just felt like home to me. So the song that I wrote was definitely like kind of folky, singer-songwritery. And so at that point, I kind of started going towards that path. I became more of an artist, but still loved playing bass and still, you know, had all these years of chops from being exposed to and immersed in all these different genres. So after college, I got dropped from my record deal, you know, like predictable or whatever, and then moved to Austin to work with a producer that I loved. And I made 3 records while I was there and toured around it as an artist. But at the same time, I was paying my bills playing bass for people. And the scene in Austin was definitely heavily Americana, country, some blues. The scene that we were playing in, me and my husband at the time, he was my boyfriend, but we just decided we should move to Nashville. And because we thought, well, we kind of want to make more money and think we're ready. So I came to Nashville thinking I was going to be a country songwriter. And again, just started kind of playing bass to make money because that's been my bread and butter. Mm-hmm. And then I got in this band with Dave Pahanish, who wrote like a whole bunch of number ones like 10 years ago or so. Mm-hmm. And in his band was Tom Bukovac and Sean Fichter and John Dederick. And I found myself in the presence of studio greats. And I fit in the band. We all became friends, and they started calling me for sessions.
Yeah, that's amazing. Mm-hmm. It's a really interesting, your journey is really interesting because it seems like you're balancing the artist, songwriter side with the hired musician side.
Right.
Is that something that was an intentional thing going in, or it sounds like what you're really into is just like being open to experiencing new things and then just kind of following where things take you? Did you have any particular intention going into it, or in the early days, like I want to be an artist versus I want to be a player, or it was just kind of like I just want to be involved in music somehow?
You know, at different points in time, there's always a clarity in my head of like this. So like certain things cancel each other out. At the time that I got invited into the studio scene, I knew that choosing to be a bass player on the road would sort of cancel that out. So I was like, I want to focus on, the studio scene. But I always had the capacity and the time to make money playing bass, and then also always have like a steady stream of pursuits that I could be completely autonomous in and totally creative in. Like I've always made records as an artist. I've always produced other artists. I've always written on the side with either other artists or staff writers, but that need to be creative and be an artist has always been there. I just desire to keep it fresh because every perfect musical situation has an expiration date. And when it expires and it starts feeling like a job, equivalent to like clocking in and doing the grind, it's like if I chose to be in music and chose to deal with all the insecurity of not knowing, if I'm going to have a gig in 3 months or, different ways of getting paid and not having a W-2 and like just all the stress and the hustle that goes into it. Well, then I want those jobs to be worth it. Like I want to feel the joy of why I got into this, and staying creative for me is usually where I find the joy.
So it's what I hear from you is that it's really great to check in with yourself and to identify if I'm taking this risk per se of having a career in music, is what I'm doing really truly fulfilling me. Now, I think the other side of that is that it can be a little complicated for some creatives to be able to balance a number of different creative paths simultaneously, where you can get a little scattered and unclear about where you're headed. It sounds like you have been able to manage that very effectively. But
thank you.
is there anything that you have found to be able to organize that direction, about being able to compartmentalize? Today I am a producer. Today I am a session player. This other day I'm a songwriter, and I'm able to do all these things with a focused intention simultaneously as they move together parallel to each other.
I don't know that I have like a system other than just like I'm driven by the love of it so much that if the love of it is missing, it's worth the flexing. You know what I mean? It does take some flexing. And there's some days where it's way, way too much. There's some days where it's like, oh my God, I wish I just did one thing. But like switching hats, that's just what I've always been good at. I'm just good at that. And even better at it once I became a mother, because that's something that I don't take into my professional environments. Gotcha. When I'm working. And then I take that hat off and I'm a mother.
Mm-hmm. And so it sounds like for you, that was kind of a natural, thing that just naturally came to you. And so I think it comes back to self-awareness. If someone is getting into this and they have a number of different aspirations, I think they need to probably think about, do I have the type of personality and the capacity to be able to separate those things? Or should I decide in this season I'm focused on this, we're going to work through that and be focused on that. So I think it's a lot of self-identification of trying to figure it out.
And being intentional, like what you said. And I think also as you were saying that, it was occurring to me that, so much of the cool stuff in my career has not been because I've said, because I've schemed some way to like get a chance to do this cool thing or whatever. A lot of the coolest stuff I've been offered has just been offered for some reason. Like, for instance, me getting that Dave Bahanish gig that led to all these other things that opened the doors. It's like, I did not go out with the intention of, if Dave Bahanish could hire me, then I could blah, 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 blah. A lot of it has just been reactive and knowing when something feels really good and going, this feels really good. I'm going to focus on this right now.
Figuring out where to get started can be a really challenging thing. And I've become very intrigued by learning about the stories about where that happens.
Yeah.
You mentioned there's this Dave Pahanish gig that you can sort of take your evolution or your tree of, of career kind of back to as a starting place.
Mm-hmm.
What was the situation that led into you being asked to be brought onto that?
Man, well, it started out with me and Brian moving to Nashville and going, okay, let's go meet some musicians. So we went and saw live music, and we were like, I don't think this is where the road, like we wanted to hang out with the musicians who were on the road with the artists, we wanted to like aim for that. We didn't want to aim for musicians who played locally. So then we kind of gradually figured out, okay, there's no touring musicians hanging out here. Where do we hang out? Then we just like ended up at a 2-for-1 at a bar, and we were like, okay, we need to go to 2-for-1s every single night. Every single night there's a 2-for-1. We go to Red Door on Tuesdays or whatever. We go to 3 Crow on Wednesdays. And that's where all the touring musicians were. They were all drinking on their nights off. Mm-hmm. So we started hanging out, making friends. Once we made friends and we told them about what we did, after, I don't know how long, couple months, 3 months, like mentions of, hey, there's a so-and-so's looking for a so-and-so, looking for a keyboard player. So-and-so's looking for this. So my husband got offered a gig in this way, and it was for an artist named Emily West. And then he becomes friends with Emily West, and Emily's like, hey, I'm hanging out with this group of writers. We do this fun thing at, oh my God, Music City Bar and Grill up in Opryland, like the most, we never would have ended up there if she didn't invite us. And it was Dave Pahanish's night, and he just had this little circle of writer friends, and he was playing acoustic. He invited me and Brian up to play our songs. So he watched me play one of my own original songs on acoustic guitar. And then he was like, yeah, I'm looking for a bass player. You want to be in my band? He had never even heard me play bass. And I was like, yeah, I do. And then I showed up to rehearsal, and it was those guys in the band. And I kind of knew who they were. I knew who Bukovac was. Actually, I knew who was in his band before I showed up to rehearsal. So when I showed up to rehearsal, I had my A game on. I was ready to go. I'm gonna fit in here. Mm-hmm.
And was that preparation based on just mentally preparing yourself because you knew who was there, or because you had been out and around these circles, you were aware of what to expect? And did you have any intuition about how to handle that because of the individuals that were there, because of the market research that you had done on?
Well, and at this point, I had played other gigs. They were just sort of like, solo moments or just like single moments that didn't quite lead to anything. So we had been here long enough that I kind of knew, unlike Austin, if you're a player in a band here, you show up knowing the music. You show up with notes, and, you show up with good gear. Mm-hmm. And so I knew enough about that. And that was basically how I prepared. I learned the songs, and yeah, like, I perform well under pressure. It's like a nice little gift from God. And so I kind of felt that pressure, felt ready to slay, and was prepared.
Yeah, that's
great. Kind of how I walk into a situation.
I've found that in traditional music education programs, when they get into the business side of things, there's a big focus on networking. And when I was in school, while I didn't go to a university, went to more of like a trade school, the conversation about networking was a lot of, go out to shows, have a business card, make connections, that sort of thing. And what you learn once you get into the community, that it's really about making friends first. Yeah. And that it's rare that you can just step into something like you would in a different industry and go like interview for a job,
right?
Or just like get an audition blindly.
Right.
Some people get kind of lucky and and can fall into something, but for the most part, the opportunities come through real organic friendships.
That's right.
That happen from just hanging out. Now that can be tough to do when you move to a town like Nashville, or when you're just made that decision in your life, regardless of where you live, that I am going to make a career in music. You're so motivated, excited, passionate about it, that you want to get out there and tell everybody about everything that you do, and try to find the opportunities. And it can be tough to stay patient, to allow the friendships and the natural process of things to work. And I feel like there should just be so much more conversation in our industry for the people that are starting their careers in the concept around the exact story that you told about how it came from hanging out at a bar, having a drink with some folks, and then waiting patiently over time instead of being too advantageous about trying to position yourself or insert yourself into a situation.
Yes, and that's a gift that we got from Austin, because in Austin the culture is a little different, where musicians they don't drop names with each other. They don't like talk about how great everything's going. They kind of get together and like bitch and moan about how broke they are. and you're kind of considered a tool if you drop names or if you make other people feel bad about where they're at. And it's fully the opposite here, culture-wise. But like me and Brian, because we came from Austin, but we were like open to assimilating, we were kind of in the middle there. And we kind of gradually learned like, okay, we don't bitch and moan about money around here. And you don't worry about making someone else feel unsuccessful, because people want to be close to someone who is successful. So if you have success, it's okay to exude that. But we're also kind of like not willing to base a relationship on an angle, you know? Like that's not, I just find that exhausting. And it's like, if we're going to be, you know, mixing work and friendship and pleasure, like, let's just be who we are. Let's just be cool people, you know? And also the other thing is that you're probably going to like the music you're playing with someone if you like the hang. You know, it's pretty rare that I love the music but I hate the hang, or vice versa. And playing music together in a band or in the studio is a super, if it's good, if it's like a genuine sort of like real music is being made, it's an emotionally intimate and vulnerable process, you know? There has to be some trust established beforehand before you can just truly open up musically. And I think meeting Dave and seeing how pure he was and how oblivious he was to any of the clickiness or like angling that we had been exposed to in the past few months, and that had made us feel really lonely, and seeing how he was so open and didn't give two shits if we had, you know, successes under our belt to tell him about. Like, we just immediately gravitated towards that. And I think he gravitated towards that about us. And I think that's why he felt he could ask me to be in his band, you know? And then once I was playing with those guys in that band, we had a synergy that became something a lot of people would come out to see. It became one of those shows that all the other session players who were either like almost session players or trying to be session players, like all the people who moved to town to play their instrument and see the greats, they would all come out to this show. I don't know, I could probably count them on two hands in my whole life where there's instances where there's just like a great momentum and a magnet, like I'm involved in like this big sort of black hole of coolness that everyone's drawn to, you know? And that was one of those times.
Yeah. That's something else that's come up quite a bit in talking with players in their journey, is getting to a place naturally through an organic relationship that leads you into being put into an environment that attracts the industry or the audience of people that are like-minded. And with a lot of people's stories, that often wasn't something that was necessarily like making them a lot of money or something that was going to be like their long-term like final position. It was just something that naturally they enjoyed doing, and because of everyone's enjoyment around it, it brought the right energy, which attracted the right people. And then all these other opportunities start to stem, you know, out from that.
Absolutely.
I think that's so powerful.
Absolutely. And especially right now when there, you know, it's such a free for all as far as how to make money. Like it's so different now. It's like every time I do a gig or show up to a session or have coffee with a new artist or book a co-write with someone I haven't written with before, or just write. Every time I have a co-write, every time I write by myself, I'm purchasing a lottery ticket. And this might unlock, you know, the next 5 years of income. It could at any point, you know? But like for me, the kind of lottery tickets I like to purchase are just easier to buy because they're so enjoyable. But I just try to like make everything that I do like there has to be a genuine musical reason. And if it's just a money reason or just a business reason, it better be really fucking good. Because if I'm playing music I don't like, then it's sort of like not really worth it.
And I think having that type of focused intention about it in what could be argued the right ways leads to more of a long-term, steady length of a career.
Yeah,
because
or at least one that I'm proud of.
Like, those other things can fizzle out when we're so focused on that end result type thing as opposed to the process of getting there. That end result could happen too soon and then go away, and then you got to figure out something else. But when you're focused on that intentional process about what just really inspires you, that's something that you can work on your entire life.
Totally.
So when we get into the creative process of approaching things, something that I'm really interested in for a musician that is also an artist songwriter, how do you manage your creative ideas when you're in the room and your job is to play bass?
I kind of have a process with this. In the first pass, before we get any comments or any sort of direction from anybody, that's where I take risks. And then after the pass, I'll know if it's working in the room, because the producer and the artist will either be like, that was so badass, or they'll be like, oh yeah, can you just do some straight eights on that chorus, And then I kind of know who I'm playing for, and whatever feedback I get, I just go with, because I respect that in that moment, I am not the artist. In that moment, I am basically a limb of the artist, and I'm doing what they don't know how to do, but I'm really serving their vision, not mine. But in general, when I'm in the studio, I know that I'm a work for hire. I'm getting paid for my time. I'm getting paid for my gear, and I'm getting paid to be chill and ready to execute someone else's vision. Mm-hmm. And that's why I've always needed to balance my life with situations where I'm also expressing my own artistic vision. Mm-hmm. And that makes me able to be super chill in the studio.
Absolutely. So when you're in that point where you're trying to translate what the artist or the producer is sharing, and maybe they know the feeling that they want, but they're not really sure how to articulate that, which is just like 90% of our job, right?
Right.
Are there any tools or approaches that you take with trying to get that communication across?
There's all kinds of different situations, but when an artist and there's a few different things. So there's times where an artist has a song that sounds nothing like their reference song, where they'll be like, so we're playing like a mid-tempo song that's sort of nostalgic or sad, and their reference is like a Bruno Mars dance song or something. It's just something that we all kind of look at each other and go, what is it that they're actually wanting from this reference? Like, and I think that there's just like a process in my brain that takes into context the artist vibe and who they are, and whether or not they like are very original or whether they're like quite derivative. And that's a big indicator, right? And
how do you determine that?
How they sound.
Instinct? Like with
instinct and how they sound. Like,
okay, so their sound, but is there anything about their personality, or like is there anything you're sort of looking at in their communication or their character that tells you like this is someone that's more has the feeling of instinctually right. that like they're more the artist than, or the creative, like try something new artist than the performer artist that may just kind of be pulling from influences or whatever? I
think it's mostly in the songs. Mostly I'm getting that information from the songs. And then sometimes it's really obvious with the artist, like what kind of dude or girl they are. And sometimes it's just in the songs. But usually you can kind of extract what they're wanting from the tone of their voice and the way they move their body. And it really is like this all hands on deck perception wise, where you really just have to kind of like try to read their mind, take into context the song, and then have enough tools to experiment with. Like, okay, like this. Okay, I think I know what you want. And then I kind of have a plan in my mind of like, I'm going to approach this take with more space in between notes, and I'm going to drive those choruses harder, and I'm going to separate the sections differently. And there's just like all these like micro calculations going on based on the talk back and how the artist is like moving. They're like, I really just want it to be more like forward and blah, 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 like whatever it is. And then taking into consideration like their reference track that may or may not be related to their song. So those are the situations where I've definitely found it challenging to be that make a wish and I will grant it, like where what they want and what the song is might be different things.
Well, I think the important thing there is that as professional players and experienced players, would you agree that you don't tell them that?
No,
right.
Definitely not.
Because I think that someone coming into it, and especially if you went to a music university and you have a degree and you're very proud of your musical knowledge and your understanding of different styles, and I've seen this happen quite a bit with younger college kids that are that maybe just graduated or they're still in college and they're collaborating and they want to have more of a conversation about how what the artist is saying is incorrect and actually what their description is of that, and a lot of times they're not even doing it to try to be like egotistical or anything. It's their way of communicating because their mind is thinking, okay, well, you're saying this, but it's just not.
It's not making sense to me. They're trying to make sense of it.
So so they get so focused on the idea of trying to make sure that the artist actually says something that combines or relates, instead of what you were saying, which more experienced players do, is trying to take, okay, I get that like these two things are different, but what is it about it that makes the artist feel something like it is connected. Yeah. So you're diving a little bit deeper rather than the surface level of these two definitions don't align. You're saying like what words within these two definitions could be related that puts the artist's mind, in that connection. I think that's a really important thing to focus on in that explanation that you're giving.
Oh, thank you. And I will also say that in these situations, it takes so much energy trying to unlock the spirit of the recording in the context of the song and the singer and all that stuff, that it is essential to have all other bases covered, so to speak. Like, it's got to be easy to learn the song. It's got to be easy to pivot from one approach to the next. It's got to be easy to communicate with and the whole band has to be on board. And that's what's really amazing about session players in this town, is that we can learn a song, most songs, because most of the songs around here are quite simple, but still, like, we can learn a song in like 3 minutes flat and we have it learned, where we can go in, play it down perfectly as far as the right notes, the right hits, the right dynamics, the right builds and arrangement. Like, we can do all that. We have all of that covered, so that then if there is sort of a quest for the right sound or the right approach, we can take all that and turn it on its head in the same amount of time, in 3 minutes flat.
When you look back, were there any experiences or exercises or practices that you did that prepared you to be able to do that? Or has it mainly just been, doing it?
There's certain things that you can't start working on until you're just in the seat. But the things that I think gave me a leg up were knowing how to sight read, because even though there's not black notes on the page, I'm familiar with not taking my eyes off of the page. And that came in really handy, just being able to read a chart down without that being stressful. And that is definitely something a skill that can be learned on your own in your own time by reading, whether it's a Nashville chart, whether it's a black page of notes, but like reading without taking your eyes off the page, and being really comfortable there was super important. And then the other thing, like, you need to have, before your first session, you need to have great tone. And you can only get great tone from playing for years and years in all different scenarios. So I just feel like before you're qualified to be a session player and have everything you do be way overanalyzed in high def, like on headphones, it's like, I mean, for me, it was playing in bars since I was fucking 12 years old, and then playing in school, and then playing in more bars, and then playing on the road, and just getting in so many hours as a player before like, it needs to be good tone needs to be muscle memory, and then those two things. And then like there is a very specific lane and social dynamic in a Nashville studio scenario. Like you can't talk too much either.
Yeah. Friendly but not too excited.
Right. Yeah. And yeah, because guaranteed on your first session, you're going to be surrounded by people who are way more experienced and therefore way better than you. And there has to be a certain humility and deference that goes into that. And I do remember on my first session, I was stressed to the max. Actually, Ilya Toshinsky called me on my first session, and it was Thompson Square doing demo sessions. Remember that band? Mm-hmm. But at the time, they were up and coming, and Ilya called me on that session, and Tom was on it, and Tom was the one who gave Ilya my number. And I was definitely stressed to the max. And there's a secret language in the studio that I never knew. And, I knew a lot of rehearsal language, and there's musician language, but then there's like a whole set of lingo and a whole etiquette that happens in the studio. And I was learning that. So it was great that my tone and my reading skills were already in my muscle memory, and I didn't have to worry about those too. And I could just concentrate on understanding this process. And wait, what the fuck did you just say? What do we add to our chart? There was just a lot of that kind of thing. And those are the things you can't get good at until your first session. So you need to have all the other things covered. So
when you're sitting in the bass chair and you're in a traditional tracking session with all the other players on the floor, where do you start to listen to? It's sort of you have to kind of absorb everything, but where does that process work for you in your mind? Or do you have a process for what you start to zero in on?
You mean like when we're playing the song down, or when we're listening to the song?
When you're both, when you're first listening to the song, you're thinking about, your approach and probably what your intuition is telling you that the drummer may do. But then once you're in the room playing it down, what are you listening for around in the other chairs that are going to maybe impact what your approach is?
I'm always trying to find the thing that makes me feel the most, that makes me emotionally connect with the song. And then whatever that is, I support it. And sometimes it's me. Sometimes I'll be feeling the song and I'll sit down in my chair and I'll come up with something really cool, and the artist will go, "Click, what you're doing right there is super cool. Let's do that." And then everyone will follow me. And sometimes, one of these incredible guitar players will sit down and come up with just like a really cool intro and a start, and it makes us all feel, and then we follow that and we follow that lead. It's like following breadcrumbs with a flashlight sometimes, but like I latch on to whatever makes me emotionally open up. And then when I'm emotionally opened up and I can follow that, that's when the coolest things come out, But from a technical standpoint, on the first takedown, I'm definitely listening for the kick pattern, the thing that determines what I play, and how it's going to work. So I play around that and I lock into that. And then I also lock into the approach the guitar players are taking, because again, that sort of like determines where I fit.
So the idea of like following the bass drum with where you're accenting things, is there anything that where does your philosophy go with that? It's obviously very song dependent, but is there anything that's happening in the other instruments within the song that would determine whether or not you have the space or whether or not you need to lock in? Is there any listening that you do outside of just the general feeling of like, where should the groove fall?
For sure. Oh yeah. I mean, I forgot to say that I listen to the melody. The melody and the singer like determines where, like how many notes I play in the groove, and also where I do fills. And also I listen for where other instruments are doing fills. There's always, like, I say always, like, there's a pretty solid rule book of Nashville songs. There's like 5 shades of Nashville songs, and like in each one of those, there's a pretty solid rule book of what you can expect to happen.
So when it comes to preparing to get in on a session or even to work remotely, you mentioned that when someone asks you for something that you don't have the tool to be able to grant their wish, that you go and look for it. What would you say starting out are sort of like the basic food groups of things that you need as a bass player to be able to cover a good majority of the things you're going to be asked to do.
In Nashville, that's what I know about in Nashville. You need to have a P bass with round wounds and a P bass with flat wounds, because sometimes you need to make your P bass sound fluffy, and sometimes you need to make it sound really edgy. You need to go through something tubey, whether it's an amp. But you don't want to always bring an amp on a demo session though, because they don't usually have room for that. I like to go through a tube DI, and then I also have some options for pedals that can like fuzz it up even more. And you need to have like probably a couple different flavors of overdrive pedal. And you this is what I use. You need to have some kind of like mixing pedal as a bass. If you're going to use pedals, you can't just use them straight, because then you're going to lose low end. I use a X Blender. It's called an X Blender by Exotic Effects, I think, who makes it. Don't quote me on that. But it blends my effects so that if I want to add just a little bit of grit, but I need to keep all my low end, I just mix in however much of the pedals I can. You know, a lot of bass players come in with a preamp and a compressor and like a whole cartridge thing like that. In my whole career, I've never been in, maybe once or twice have I been at a studio wishing I wish I had control over my preamp and my compressor right now. But there's in almost all scenarios in this town in my career, there has been a preamp and a compressor set aside for the bass in the studio, and an engineer that knows what he wants. And I give him my sound, which is a P bass through a tube DI and maybe a couple pedals, and he's able to turn it into something amazing.
In your home studio, do you have a preference on like preamp, compressor, other signal chain outside of your DI?
I usually buy for my overdub studio. I'm trying to buy stuff that works for both vocals and bass. So what I have right now that I love is just I have a lunchbox, and I go through an API 512C preamp, and then Retro Instruments double wide tube compressor to warm things up. And it works great for vocals, and it works great for bass.
How have you found as a bass player that you like to hear compression on your instrument when you're tracking it?
I like to hear none, because then it tells me whether or not I'm playing right. I play too hard if there's compression, because I'm trying to get a dynamic range, and then it's not working.
Right.
So a lot of times it's frustrating because the cue box really matters a lot, because a lot of times those things will compress stuff even if the engineer isn't. And I can really hear it in the bass zone a lot. And sometimes I'm like, are you compressing me? And they're like, no, it's barely touching it. And I'm like, oh, it's a fucking cue box.
Yeah.
But yeah, I get through it.
So, and I would imagine that you would agree that it's important to know a bit about that side of the world too, with compression and signal chain and that sort of thing, in order to be able to work remotely in the modern industry of being a studio player. There's a lot of opportunity for remote work, but also to be able to gauge if you're trying to get an emotional statement across on your instrument, and there's too much of something happening in the control room that's holding that back. How do you deal with the communication with your engineer in the process?
You know, I've been in situations where I don't know what I'm hearing, because, you know, when I first started out, I would argue that it takes years to develop your ear to be able to pinpoint how to solve a problem. So before my ear was developed, which was, you know, like literally the first 8 years of my session career, I would say. I knew from an arrangement perspective what needed to happen, but I hadn't gotten down to the nitty gritty of hearing the EQ and the compression and the whole picture of things. That's been in the past, 7 years that I've gotten more into that. But what I used to do is just tell the engineer what I was struggling with. Like, I'm having trouble hearing any definition in my bass right now. It might be the whole mix. It might be my bass line, either way. Like, and then you might see if he's able to like actually make a difference. And then you know that you're working with someone who's super skilled. If they're not able to make a difference, the best thing then is to just figure out how to cope and give them the best results.
So throughout your career, you've had a wide range of incredible, experiences. And you mentioned kind of starting in, demo world, obviously transitioning into playing on a bunch of amazing records. As you progressed through that, with your intention about wanting to be around things that inspire you, I imagine there's also as you mentioned, everyone wants to kind of feel like they've accomplished something, As those accomplishments, start to occur or don't occur at the timeline in which you expect them to, what sort of tools have you built around yourself to be able to stay in an inspired spirit while you're managing your expectations for what your career looks like?
The number one thing that has been my lifeblood has been this song group that I have. I lead a song group of 8 people with always a running list of 20 to 30 people. And we turn in a solo written song every single week. And we turn it in by the deadline or we're kicked out of the group. And I always do it because I lead the group. So
Gotcha.
Depending on how much work I have, if I have a lot of work, it's a guitar vocal work tape or a piano vocal work tape. If I got nothing on the books, well, that's when I dig into pop production and I make a track every week. But either way, it keeps me checking in with who I am as an artist and why I do this and what I have to say on that day in this moment for no other reason than this is what I do. And I have no aspirations for this song other than to turn it into this group. So I'm going to say whatever I want and in the way I want to say it. And I create the best art in that group.
That's great. So it's a process for you to be able to pull back into the innocence of what got you into creating music in the first place. And that
which
helps
is
you
what we covered before, which is what creates real momentum anyway. Mm-hmm. It's actually not just a way to stay healthy. It's actually probably the best career move I could make as well.
That's incredible.
Yeah.
What do you wish that you knew when you got into following the path of making a living for the rest of your life playing music?
I wish I paid less attention to industry wisdom and the ideas around this is who you should please and this is what you should aim for musically. I wish I had spent less time aiming for something and more time discovering things that feel good.
That's incredible. Well, thank you so much for taking the time to be on the show with us.
Thanks for having me.
We got to have you back again so we can talk about production,
definitely,
and songwriting, all the other stuff that you're
definitely
getting into now. But this was incredible. Thank you.
Thank you. Great to talk to you.
You too.